princes generally passed their evenings in the company of their intimate friends. One of them was, most of the time, at the house of Madame Napoleon, to whom he paid attentions that were justified by her constancy in her behavior. Frequent attempts were made to destroy the intimacy, but in vain, for Madame Napoleon was above all the cabals employed for the purpose, and in addition to her amiable manners and excellent conduct, was completely disinterested and carefully avoided all interference in political affairs. She saw but very little company. I was indebted to a female relative for the pleasure of being admitted to it, but as it was necessary to withdraw before the prince's arrival, I never had the honor of seeing him there. Monsieur passed his evenings at Madame de Balby's, Dame de Tour du Madame de Balby, who was lively, witty, a warm friend, and a determined enemy, attracted all the most distinguished characters. It was an honor to be admitted to her house, which was a center of taste and fashion. Monsieur sometimes remained there until a late hour, and when after the crowd had slipped away and the circle was contracted, he happened to be communicative. It must be confessed that he was as superior to us by the charms of his conversation as by his rank and dignity. So much for our manner of living and our outward appearances at Coblentz. This was the fair side of our situation, but we were less happy in a political point of view. That was the degrading side. Good, said the emperor. I accordingly begin to find your drawing room details too long. This is, however, excusable in you. The subject is a pleasing one to you. You were then young, but go on. Sire, the whole of our number was but a noble and brilliant mob, and presented the image of complete confusion. It was anarchy striving without to establish. It was set order within, a real democracy struggling for the re-establishment of its aristocracy. We presented on a small scale of merely with a few shades of difference a copy of everything that was passing in France. We had among us zealous adherents to our ancient forms and ardent admirers of novelty. We had our constitutionalists, our intolerants, and our moderates. We had our empirics, who sincerely regretted that they had not made themselves masters of the king's person for the purpose of acting with violence in his name, or who frankly avowed that they entertained the design of declaring his incapability. Finally, we had also our Jacobins, who wished on their return to kill, to burn, to destroy everything. No direct authority was exercised over the multitude by our princes. They were our sovereigns, it was true, but we were very unruly subjects and very easily irritated. We murmured on every occasion, and it was particularly against those who joined us last that our common fury was directed. It was, we declared, so much glory and good fortune of which they deprived our exploits and our hopes. Those who were once admitted considered every subsequent arrival too late. It was maintained that all merit on that score was at an end. If all were continued to be received in the same way, the whole of France would soon be on our side, and there would be no longer any person to punish. Denunciations of every kind and from every quarter were then showered down upon those who joined us. A Prince de Saint-Maurice, son of the Prince of Montbarry, found it impossible to resist the storm, although he had the formal support of every distinguished character and that of the prince himself, who deigned to employ supplication in his favor, and said, "Alas, gentlemen, who is there that is not false to reproach himself within the revolution? I have been guilty of several, and by your oblivion of them, you have given me the right of interceding for others. This did not spare Monsieur de Saint-Maurice the necessity of making his escape as soon as possible. His crime was that of having belonged to the Society of the Friends of the Negroes, and of having been violently attacked in the midst of us by a gentleman of Franche-Comté, who denounced Monsieur de Saint-Maurice for having caused his mansions to be burnt. It was, however, discovered a few days afterwards that the brawling assailant had no mansion, and was neither from Franche-Comté nor a gentleman. He was a mere adventurer. Monsieur de Cazaux, who had filled France and Europe with the celebrity of his eloquence and courage in the National Assembly, had notwithstanding lost the popular favor at Koblenz. When he arrived at Paris, a report was spread among us that the princes would not see him or would give him an ungracious reception. We collected 80 natives of Languedoc to be in opposition to his own wishes, a kind of escort to him. Monsieur de Cazals was the honor of our province. We conducted him to the princes, by whom he was well received. A deputy of the Third Estate, who had highly distinguished himself in the Constituent Assembly by his attachment to royalty, was among us. One of our princes, addressing him one day in a crowd, said, "But, sir, explain to me then. You are so worthy a man. How could you at the time take the oath of the jeu de paume?" Tennis game. The deputy, struck dumb by the attack, at first stammered out that he had been taken unawares, that he did not foresee the fatal consequences, but promptly recovering himself, he replied with vivacity, "I shall, however, observe to Monseigneur that it was not that which led to the ruin of the French monarchy, but in fact the union of the nobility, which joined us in consequence of the very persuasive letter written by Monseigneur." "Stop there!" exclaimed the prince, touching him gently in the stomach. "Be cool, my dear sir. I did not intend to vex you by that question." Something like a system of regularity, whether good or bad, was, however, adopted. In the course of time, we were classed by corps and by provinces. We had cantonments assigned to us and were supplied with arms. The king's bodyguards were again formed, clothed, equipped, and paid, and soon became a superb corps in appearance and discipline. The coalition of Auvergne and the Marine Corps, part on foot and part on horseback, attracted peculiar notice by its discipline, knowledge, and union. Our resignation and self-denial could not be too much admired. Each officer was henceforth but a private soldier, subject to exercises and fatigues very contrary to his former manner of life, and exposed to the greatest privations. For there was no pay, and many of that number had shortly no resource to depend on but the contributions of their more fortunate comrades. We deserved a better fate, or to speak more correctly, we were worthy of a better enterprise. All the officers belonging to the same regiments had been collected together in separate bodies in order that they might be ready to take the command of their soldiers who would not fail to join them, as we thought, on their first seeing them. Such was our delusion. It was from a similar motive that the gentlemen were classed according to their respective provinces, no doubt being entertained of their efficient influence over the mass of the population. Our weakness consisted in the conviction that we continued to be desired, respected, and adored. All these bodies were publicly exercised and maneuvered, and the diplomatic remonstrances which were made on the subject were answered with a confident assurance that no such thing existed, or that it certainly should be prevented. We had generals nominated, a staff formed, and everything which distinguished his headquarters, even to the office of Grand Provost, arranged. Our princes were gradually surrounded with all that constitutes a real government. They had ministers for the affairs of the moment, and even for France, when we should return. So certain and near at hand at that time appear Monsieur de la Villenoix, who was afterwards so much talked of with respect to the share he had in a royalist conspiracy, and who died at Saint-Marie in consequence of the events of Fructidor, was entrusted with the administration of the police. He set off at an early period to perform its duties clandestinely in Paris. He had conceived a sincere affection for me and was determined to make me his son-in-law. He made use of the most urgent arguments to induce me to follow him, but I refused. I disliked the nature of his office. Otherwise, what different combinations of my destiny. We had also direct relations with almost every court. The princes had envoys at them and received theirs at Koblenz. Monseigneur the Count d'Artois visited, I think, Vienna, but I can state with certainty that he was at Pillnitz. The nobility in our body addressed a letter to Catherine, from whom we received Monsieur de Romanzoff as ambassador. That empress saw with pleasure the storm that was rising in the south of Europe. She cheerfully augmented a conflagration which might prove very favorable to her views without putting her to any expense, and she accordingly showed herself zealous in her sentiments and ardent in her promises. She did not despair in that crisis of making a dupe of Gustavus III, whose contiguous activity was troublesome to her. She had prevailed upon him, it is said, to undertake the crusade by flattering him with the rank of generalissimo. I do not know if this prince, who certainly was a very superior character for his time and possessed a great share of understanding and talent, suffered himself to be deluded by her. It is, however, undeniable that he displayed great attachment to our cause and announced his wish to take the field in person. When he left Aix-la-Chapelle to arrange his ultimate measures for that purpose in Sweden, I heard him say on taking leave of the Prince of Lamballe, "You will see me again shortly, but I am, notwithstanding, obliged on my own account to adhere to certain proceedings, to certain measures of caution, for the part I have to play is of a very delicate nature. Know that I, who am desirous of returning to fight at the head of your aristocrats in France, am at home the first democrat of the country." We also received from envoys from Louis XVI, who presented public messages in reprobation of our conduct and were admitted to confidential conferences on subjects perhaps essentially different. At least we acted as if that had been the case, openly declaring that he was a captive and that we ought to take no notice of any of his orders, that we were bound to take everything he was compelled to say in a contrary sense, and that when he exhorted us to peace, he was in reality calling upon us to go to war. It is accordingly my opinion that we were very fatal to the tranquility of the unfortunate monarch, and that we had our special share in the pardon which he bequeathed by his will in favor of his friends, who by an indiscreet zeal, as he observes, did him so much injury. Our emigration, however, was prolonged in spite of all the promises which were made to us, and of all the hopes with which our fancy was flattered. With what illusions, what idle tales, what absurdities was our impatience mocked! Whether those who invented them anticipated our disappointment or were themselves deceived, it was pleasantly calculated that, according to our letters and gazettes, we had in less than 18 months raised nearly 2 millions of men who were under martial, though we ourselves had seen none of them. But those initiated in the mystery assured us in special confidence that these troops marched only by night for the purpose of a more effectually surprising the Democrats, or that they passed in the daytime only by platoons and without uniform, or told us some other story of a similar kind. On the other hand, we showed each other a heap of letters from all countries and the best sources, written in an enigmatical style, in which were thought to be intelligible to us alone. One was acquainted the 50,000 Bohemian crystals had been just sent off for his country. Another was informed of an approaching consignment of 10,000 pieces of Saxon porcelain, and a third received intelligence that 25,000 bales of cocoa would be addressed to him, with other fooleries of the same kind. How was it possible, I now inquire, that men of understanding, for there certainly were a great many among the number, that ancient ministers who had governed us and others who were destined to succeed them, should be gulled by such wretched stuff, or that the plain good sense which he possessed as a multitude did not make us laugh in their faces? But no, we were not the less convinced that we were near the accomplishment of our hopes, that the moment was at hand, that it would infallibly happen, that we had only to show ourselves, that we were eagerly expected, and that all would fall prostrate at our feet. Here the emperor, who had often interrupted me with laughter and raillery, said in a very serious tone, "How very faithful is the picture you have drawn! I recognize the crowd of your friends in it. Truly, my dearest causes, and I say it without meaning any offense to you. Vaporing, credulity, inconsistency, stupidity itself might be said, in spite of all their wit, to be their special lot. When I occasionally wished to be amused, and divested myself of all reserve for the purpose of giving them full scope and encouraging their confidence in me, I have heard in the Tuileries, under the Consulate and the Empire, things no less ridiculous than those which you now notice. None of them ever entertained a doubt of anything. The love of the French for their kings was centered, they assured me, in my person. I could henceforth do what I pleased. I had a right to use my power. I should never meet with any other obstacle but a handful of incorrigible persons who were the detestation of all. That counter-revolution, so much dreaded, observed in others, was but child's play to me. I had effected it with the utmost ease, and will this be believed? The only thing wanting to it, said he in an insinuating tone, is the substitution of the ancient white color for those which have done us so much injury in all countries. The idiot! That was the only blot which he could find in our escutcheon. I laughed out of sheer pity, although I felt some difficulty in restraining my feelings. But for his part, his sincerity was unquestionable. He was fully persuaded that he spoke as I thought, and still more so that the generality thought as he did. But go on! The appearance of the Duke of Brunswick at Koblenz and the arrival of the King of Prussia at the head of the troops were great subjects of joy and expectation for the whole of the emigration. Heaven opens its length before us, was our exclamation, and we are about to return to the land of promise. It was, however, the opinion of persons of judgment and experience from the beginning that our struggle would have the same result as all those never sounded in history, and that we should be but instruments and pretexts for foreigners who only pursue their private interest and entertained no feeling for us. Monsieur de Cazaux, who had in a short time been much improved, expressed himself to that effect with much energy. We beheld with delight the Prussians as they filed off through the streets of Koblenz on their march to our frontiers. Foolish boys, he exclaimed. You admire with enthusiasm those troops and all their trade. You rejoice at their march. You ought rather to shudder at it. For my own part, I should wish to see these soldiers to the last man of them plunged into the Rhine. Unhappy are they who incite foreigners to invade their country. Oh, my friends, the French nobility will not survive this atrocity. They will have the affliction of expiring far from the places of their birth. I am more guilty than any other, for I see it, and yet I act like all the rest. But my only excuse is that I cannot prevent the catastrophe. I repeat, unhappy they who call in foreigners and trust in them against their country. How wise and oracular these last words! Facts would have speedily convinced us of their truth had we been less infatuated, or had the multitude been capable of reasoning and acting with propriety. But we were destined to enrich history with one of those lessons that are most entitled to the meditation of mankind. We might be estimated at 20 or 25,000 men under arms, and certainly such a force filled with ardor and devotion, fighting for its own interests, maintaining an understanding with the sympathetic elements of the interior, acting against a nation shaken to its foundation and convulsed by the agitation of new rights not yet established, and but imperfectly understood, might be capable of striking decisive blows. But it was not upon our strength, our success, our activity that the foreigners relied for the attainment of their views. Accordingly, under the pretense of employing that influence and of directing its operation, as is said, against several points at once, they annihilated us by parceling out our numbers and by making, as it were, prisoners of us in the middle of their different corps. In this way, 6,000 of us under the Prince of Condé were marched against Alsace, 4,000 under the Duke de Bourbon were to act in Flanders, and from 12 to 15,000 continued in the center under the command of the King's two brothers to cooperate in the invasion of Champagne. It had been the plan and wish of our princes that Monsieur, as heir to the crown and the natural representative of Louis XVI, considering his captivity, should proclaim himself regent of the kingdom the moment he set foot on the French territory, that he should march with his emigrants at the head of the expedition, and that the allies in his rear should be considered only as our auxiliaries. But the allies treated the plans with derision and confined us to a station at their tail under the orders and at the will and pleasure of the Generalissimo Brunswick, who caused us to be preceded by the most absurd of manifestos, from the ridicule and odium of which, however, he at least preserved us. It is but just, however, to acknowledge that this treatment had not escaped the foresight of some experienced and better advised heads amongst us. They had accordingly suggested, it was said in the council of the princes, that we should throw ourselves before the arrival of the allies on some point of France and maintain a civil war there by ourselves. Others more desperate, more ardent, were of opinion that we should nobly seize upon the states of the Elector of Treves, our benefactor, occupy the towns and fortress of Koblenz, and establish their central point of rallying or support independent of the Germanic body. And when we exclaimed against such perfidy and ingratitude, the answer was, desperate evils call for desperate remedies. It is impossible to say what might have been the result of such resolutions, which were, however, more consistent with the bold spirit of enterprise that characterizes the present times than with the state of matters as they then existed. They were therefore unattended to, and besides, the opportunity had slipped by. We were too closely involved in the midst of foreigners. We were already in their power, and our destiny was to be fulfilled. The multitude of us was far from foreseeing the calamities that were to attend us. We began our march in high spirits. There was not one of us who did not expect to be within 15 days from that moment at home triumphant in the midst of his submissive, humiliated, and increased vassals. Our confidence would not have endured a single observation or doubt upon that head. Of this, I am about to give an instance, which, though personal with respect to myself, and very trifling in itself, will not be the less characteristic with respect to us all. We were marching through the city of Treves. One of my granduncles had, during the War of the Succession, been the governor for Louis XIV. While we retained possession of it, I went to see his tomb, which is in a chapel belonging to the Carthusians of that town. The ardor of my youth and the emotion of the moment determined me to erect a small monument to his memory with a superb inscription suitable to the circumstances. I entertained no doubt of executing my wish. The good friars were of a different way of thinking. The prior wished me to arrange the matter with the abbé, a kind of bishop, and of German bishop. His reserve and coldness, in spite of his numerous coats of arms, prepossessed me very much against him when I communicated my chivalrous project. But when, after some circumlocution, he declared that under the present circumstances, prudence, discretion, if the French were to enter the place at these last words, my indignation was extreme. It was such that I did not wait to utter a single word in reply. I instantly hurried away with a mingled laugh of contempt and anger, convinced that I had left the most horrible Jacobin in existence behind me, and nothing but my natural generosity and respect for my own character could have prevented me calling in my comrades, who would have certainly pulled down the chapel. But alas, the abbot saw farther than I did. 3 weeks had not elapsed before the Republicans were in Treves, the poor abbé put to flight, and the ashes of my good uncle profaned by the infidels. But we had scarcely engaged in full operations. We had hardly set foot on French ground before it became no difficult matter, except in cases of stupidity and blindness, to comprehend that it actually might be just possible that we had been the dupes of our own folly. We found ourselves in the midst of the Prussians, who fettered all our movements. We could not take a step in advance to the right or left without their permission, and they never granted it. Our subsistence, all our resources, depended solely upon their will. We had the shame of presenting ourselves as slaves on the soil where we aspired to reign. As to our countrymen, instead of receiving us as their deliverers, as we had been convinced they would, they only gave us proofs of dislike and aversion. With the exception of a few country gentlemen or others who joined us, the whole mass of the population fled at our approach. We were treated as enemies with the look of reproach and the stern silence of reprobation. They seemed to say to us, "Do you not shudder then at thus staining your country's soil? Are you not Frenchmen by birth to your hearts that make no appeal to you in favor of your native land? You say you are wrong, but what wrong, what injury ever gave to a son the right or the feeling to tear open the bosom of a mother? We are told that in ancient times a fiery patrician, Coriolanus, was infamous enough to fight against his country, but he had at least the merit of uniting elevated sentiments with his furious passion. He came forward with a victorious arm. He imposed his own conditions. He was not dragged along at the tail of barbarous foreigners. He commanded them, and he also suffered himself to be moved to compassion. Can you be unsusceptible of that tenderness? And do you not tremble at our maledictions, which will be perpetuated on you by our children? And even in that case, whatever may be your success, it will not equal your sorrow. You pretend to come for the purpose of governing. and you will have brought your masters with you. We were quartered in town at Verdun and at Esten. Some of my comrades and myself were lodged in a handsome house, but all the furniture and all the proprietors had disappeared, with the exception of two very pretty young ladies who put us in possession of it. This last circumstance seemed a favorable omen. We took the opportunity of remarking it to them, and were desirous of ingratiating ourselves by our politeness and attentions. Gentlemen, said one of the two Amazons in rather a sharp tone, we have remained because we have felt we had the courage to tell you face to face that our lovers are in arms against you, and that they have our prayers at least as much as our hearts. This was intelligible language. We wished for no more of it, and even shifted our quarters to another house. Be it as it may, we were at length in France, and in the rear of that Prussian army which pushed forward its brilliant successes, leaving us 3 or 4 marches behind. And whether their object was to turn us into ridicule, because we had assured them that all the towns would throw open their gates at our appearance, or to free themselves from our importunities, they charged us with the siege of Thionville. We made our approaches, and by a fantastical singularity, the Marine Corps found itself precisely opposed to the National Volunteers at Brest. When they recognized each other, it is impossible to describe the volley of invectives and insults that was instantly exchanged. Thionville is, however, as it is known, one of the strongest places, and we found the reduction of it impossible by our limited means, for we were in want of everything, and it absolutely required an important negotiation to obtain 2 24-pounders from the Austrians at Luxembourg. After a great deal of solicitation and hesitation, the 2 pieces were at length brought in triumph, and it was with that formidable train that we summoned the place and fired at night in pure waste of powder some hundreds of cannon shot on my return from emigration, having fallen by chance into company with the General de Wimpfen, who commanded the fortress. He asked me what could have been our intention, or the meaning of the jest we had thus attempted to play off. It was done, I believe, said I, because reliance was placed upon you. But even had that been the case, said he, you still ought to have furnished me with an excuse for surrendering. You could have expected I should solicit you to attack me. Everything was on a proportionate scale. The slightest sally spread confusion through all our forces. The most trifling circumstance was an event with us. The cause was obvious. We were unacquainted with everything, and accordingly, putting courage aside, I did not scruple to believe that 100 picked men of the Imperial Guard would have routed the whole of our army. Happily, our adversaries were as ignorant as ourselves. All were pygmies then. All in a very short time giants were found everywhere. We remained very discontented with all this under our tents and on our bad straw, but à la Francais, we found relief in our gaiety. Our ill humor evaporated in puns and jests. All our principal officers had nicknames. There was now one to our commander-in-chief, the venerable Marshal de Broglie, who escaped us, and this puts me in mind of a circumstance which gave rise to a nickname for one of his lieutenants, of which he never got rid. Should any of my comrades in the field ever read this, it may even now excite a laugh. At the moment of a sally, which as usual made us very uneasy, everyone pressed forward. We had 2 small pieces of cannon, which we had bought, and which for want of horses were drawn by the officers of artillery themselves. Well, observed the Emperor, I might myself have been attached to these very pieces, and yet what different combinations our destinies and in those of the world, for it is incontestable that I have given an impulse and direction to it emanating solely from myself. But go on. Sire, our 2 small pieces were in progress along the highway when the general officer of the day arrived at full gallop and stopped with indignation at the sight of our little cannon as they were drawn towards the fortress with the breach in advance. How, exclaimed he, are these really gentlemen who draw their cannon in this manner against the enemy? And if he were actually to present himself, how could you contrive to fire upon him? He persisted in his blunder, refusing to comprehend what the officers of artillery auxiliaries strove by every possible means to explain that such was the manner of acting everywhere, and that unless he had some new invention to communicate, there was no other mode to be adopted. From that moment, we dubbed him by a nickname by which he soon became universally known. But all this burlesque was soon exchanged for what was serious in the extreme. The scene shifted, as it were, by magic, and our misfortunes burst upon us in an instant, whether from treachery, weakness, political interest, or a sickness in his army, from the real superiority of force or the mere dexterity of the French general. The King of Prussia entered into secret negotiation with him, suddenly faced about, and, marching to the frontier, evacuated the French territory. A most dreadful storm now burst over our heads. Words are inadequate to express the scandalous treatment we experienced, as well as the just indignation which could not fail to animate every generous heart against our allies, the Prussians. Our princes degraded, disavowed, insulted by them. Our equipages, our most necessary effects, even our linen plundered. Our persons ill-used, and thus we were basely driven and thrust beyond the frontiers by our friends, the Allies. For my part, sinking under the fatigue of 2 long marches in the mud and under torrents of rain, bending under a musket and a load of accoutrements, hurtful only to myself, I took advantage of my privilege as a volunteer to leave the ranks and effect my retreat as well as I could. I proceeded as occasion served. I never sought the common halting place. I took refuge in the nearest farmyard. Whether it was my own peculiar good fortune or because the peasants were in reality kind and not exasperated against us, I passed the frontier without any unlucky accident. It was not until some time afterwards that I was enabled to form a correct estimate of the whole extent of the danger to which I had exposed myself, when I read in the papers that from 15 to 18 of us, stragglers like myself, and some of whom stood near me in their ranks, had been seized, dragged to Paris, and executed in public in a kind of auto da fe, act of faith, and as it were by way of expiation. As soon as we were out of France, we received notice to disband, but the intimation was superfluous, for that measure was rendered absolutely indispensable by our wants and the deprivation of every necessary article. We dispersed ourselves, trusting our way to chance. With despair and rage for our companions, we traveled as fugitives the greater part of the time on foot, and some almost naked, over the scenes of our past splendor and luxury, happy when the doors were not shut in our faces, when we did not receive a brutal repulse. For 1 instant, we were officially driven from every quarter. We were prohibited from residing in or from entering all the neighboring states. We were compelled to take refuge in distant countries and to exhibit throughout Europe the spectacle of our miseries, which ought to have been a grand moral and political lesson to the people, to the great, and to the kings. The exploits of the French exacted, however, from foreigners a cruel expiation of the indignities with which they overwhelmed us, whilst on our part we experienced a kind of consolation in seeing the honor of the emigration take refuge in the army of Condé, which displayed itself to public view and inscribed itself in history as a model of loyalty, valor, and consistency. Such, sire, is that too celebrated era, that fatal determination which, with respect to a great number, can be considered only as a delusion of youth and inexperience. None, however, but themselves possessed the right of reproaching them with the error. The sentiments by which they were actuated were so pure, so natural, so generous, that they might even, were it necessary, derive honor from them. And these dispositions, I must say, belong to the mass of which we consisted, and more particularly to that crowd of country gentlemen who, sacrificing all and expecting nothing, without fortune as well as without hope, displayed a devotion truly heroic, because its only aim was the performance of duties which they held to be sacred. In other respects, our defect lay in our political education, which did not teach us to distinguish our duties, and made us dedicate to the prince alone what belonged to the country at large. Accordingly, in future times, when the hostile passions shall be extinct, when no traces shall be left of jarring interests or of party infatuation and fury, what was doubtful with us will be positive and clear to others. What was excusable or even allowable in us, who were situated between an ancient order of things that was on the point of terminating and a new one that was about to commence, will be considered highly culpable in those in possession of established doctrines. Among them, the following will be held as articles of faith. First, that the greatest of all crimes is the introduction of a foreign power into the heart of one's country. Secondly, that the sovereignty cannot be erratic, but that it is inseparable from the territory and remains attached to the mass of citizens. Thirdly, that the country cannot be transported abroad, but that it is immutable and entire on its settled soil, which has given us birth, and which contains the bones of our ancestors, such are the grand maxims, and many others besides, which will remain the offspring of our emigration, such the great truths, which will be collected from our calamities.